It is finally time for me to say this. My novel, my first novel, The Witch People, is now out on the international market. It's out. It's released. Oh, it is so scary and fun at the same time. So now you can find the English version of my book everywhere where you buy books, like Amazon, for example. I put the link in the description so you can find it. And this story is fantasy / paranormal romance book. So if you like that sort of style, I think you will like this one. So now I will read you a part of the book. I will read chapter 16. And I chose chapter 16 because it will tell you a lot about the atmosphere in the book, but it will not be any spoilers. So I will just give you a little, a little glimpse of it. So let's go. Let's read a little. I hope you like it. No one knew what her real name was, not even herself. Massa's life had started as miserably as many others at this time on Earth. Pestilence and disease followed each other so quickly that misery was a normal state. The fact that more than half of a village inhabitants died in less than 2 weeks was nothing remarkable. In 1225, almost 2 years after the girl had been born, it was time for her little village to fall into misery. The thing called the Big Cough swept across the country, and it was horribly contagious. The affected person first became feverish and drowsy, then coughed until the lungs felt like they were on fire. It took less than a week before the infected person was dead. There was no point in changing the sheets, because as soon as a bloody sheet was changed, new blood was quickly coughed up. If there was anyone alive who could change the bed linen, of course. People fled in panic when the cough came, and it happened that the sick were completely abandoned. Mothers left their children to die in their beds. The old ones were thrown out of the house. They had to cope as best as they could. Bodies were burned to eradicate the cough, but in the eagerness to get rid of the disease, some people were burned even though they were not fully dead. The girl's parents were serfs and belonged to one of the many large farmers in the area. They lived in something that looked more like an earthen cellar than a cabin. A rectangular hole in the ground with a low stone wall to hold up the roof. That was what they called their home. The roof was covered with peat and moss, and the door was so low that the adults could barely get in or out through it. The cellar was small, dark and damp, but at least there was a small fireplace to keep them warm in the winter. They had no possessions. Not even the clothes on their bodies were their own, and their rags were not much to have either. The earthen cellar and the few things in it were owned by the big farmer, even the people. But then the cough came, and everyone in the village, which consisted of about 20 people, died, even the big farmer himself. The only one who miraculously did not get infected was the little girl. It took several days before the wagon that collected the corpses for the pyre appeared. Had it not been for the fact that the small door to the earthen cellar was open and flapping in the wind, the grave digger would not have noticed that the cellar existed. But he did, and the sight that met him was heartbreaking. He had seen a few things before. Sadness and badly decomposed corpses was his everyday life, and it didn't bother him much. But he couldn't help but feel his heart break when he found a small child sitting with a blank stare by her mother's swollen corpse. He took her to the city where there was a house for orphans. He told the woman who took her in that the girl was the only survivor in the village where he found her. She was really lucky, poor girl, he said as he handed her over. Whether she was lucky or not should be left unsaid, because her long life started so sad that most people would probably have seen an early death as a salvation. But now she lived anyway. Her name was unknown, and because she had arrived so dirty, with moss and peat in her ash-blonde hair, she was simply called Mossa. Life in the poorhouse was not easy. It was run by almoses, and there weren't many of them. The food was never enough to fill the children's stomachs. There was no future for the children who ended up there either. At best, you became a serf. At worst, you died before you were even 5 years old. When Mossa was 4 years old, it was time for her to start working in the poorhouse. Her job was to soak clothes in lye before they were scrubbed clean by an older girl. The lye corroded her soft little hands, and she always had sores and blisters that stung and burned. There were times when she would cry in despair at the pain, but such fashions were immediately banished by the housewife who hit her with her cane. Putting her hands in lye was always a painful situation. It was just a matter of choosing. Either do it or get beaten. And choosing a beating rarely helped, because once she was beaten, she still had to soak the clothes in the caustic water. She liked it, the housewife. Her eyes glowed with a mix of anger and satisfaction as she beat the children. She enjoyed watching them try to back away from the blows. It provoked her and pleased her at the same time. That made her want to beat them even more, and she did. No tenderness was ever to be found in the poorhouse. The children went to bed hungry and cold. No one said good night. No one stroked their hair when they had bad dreams. It does something to a child when it is not allowed to feel warmth and love. It matters when you are small and the autumn cold takes hold and there is no loving mother to care for you. It does something to a child when the blanket is torn away and a hard blow with the cane comes across the little back. Mossa learned early in life what hate was. She hated the housewife. Everyone did. She was 7 years old when she was sold as a slave to a farm. They didn't beat her as badly there, and she got better food. But there were worse things to fear there. When the new housewife and her children had gone to bed, the master of the house came into Mossa's little room and declared that if she did not do as he said, he would sell her to the brothel in town. You know what they do with little girls there? They tie them to the beds, and then they may be 7 or 8 of them who take them in a row. So this is much better, he said, taking off his clothes. You should be grateful that I'm good enough to not sell you, but then you must obey me, otherwise I might change my mind. Mossa kept quiet, although she often cried so much that she vomited. When Mossa was 12, he got tired of coming in to her at night. She was too big, he said. Then he decided it was time to sell her. She had begged him not to sell her to the brothel, but he knew he could get plenty of money out of it for such a young girl. Probably his profit would be greater than if he sold her to a farm. Farmers were stingy. They didn't give much for a spindly girl who could barely lift a jug of milk. She sat in the carriage that slowly rocked towards the city gates and the wild place that would soon be her new home. She had cried so much that she was completely drained of emotions. She sat there, staring blankly with her hands tied to the carriage. She wasn't even afraid. She just wanted to die. The housewife had cried and argued with her husband. She wanted them to sell the girl to a farm and not to such a horrible place as the one in the city. But then he had beaten his wife so badly that she had fallen and remained motionless on the floor for quite a while. The carriage stopped outside the infamous house. There was nothing remarkable about the house. A 2-story half-timbered house that looked like any other house in the small city. But everyone knew what was going on there. He went in to negotiate a price for Mossa and left her alone outside. Mossa sat quietly in the carriage. She stared blankly in front of her, barely noticing that 5 women came out of the house. They were dressed in colorful dresses and had painted faces. They talked about something amongst themselves and giggled. The draft carried a strong scent of their sweet perfumes, and it made Mossa look up. One of the women noted the distressed girl tied to the carriage. She stopped, turned, and looked at Mossa as her friends continued down the street. The woman made sure no one was watching her. Then she quickly walked over to the carriage. "This is no place for a little girl," she said, and quickly untied the rope around Mossa's wrists. "There, run now." The woman turned and hurried to catch up with her friends and disappeared down the street. It took Mossa a couple of seconds to understand what had happened. But when the realization that she was free hit her, she jumped off the wagon and ran. She didn't know where she was going or what she was going to do, but she ran. She ran as fast as she could. Life on the streets was hard, but at least she was free. She lived by stealing food and slept hidden under rubble in the alleys. She was not alone living her life like that. Many children and young people lived that way after the plagues had taken whole families. They were hated by everyone. Even slaves had higher standing. She was now what people called thieves and scum, who were beaten as soon as they showed themselves openly. Mossa stayed away from people during the day and came out in the evenings. She looked for pieces of bread that had been dropped during the markets in the square. She avoided to be too close to inns. There was food to steal there, but also drunken men. She had learned to endure being beaten. The hard part was to getting used to other things men could bring themselves to do. Sometimes she managed to break free from someone who grabbed her and forced her to the ground in the alley, and sometimes not. Life was lonely. None of the children on the street were friends. When the smallest piece of bread is hard currency, you can't trust anyone. She stayed at her part of the city, where she thought she could avoid the worst dangers and the gangs of men who troubled town. But one day, when she was 15, she couldn't escape them. She had just stolen a fried chicken stick when they caught sight of her. She was eating her chicken, crouched in one of the alleys. They quickly surrounded her. One kicked her so hard in the face that she almost lost consciousness. It's strange what you think when you're very hungry, because her biggest worry wasn't that they hit her, but that the chicken fell out of her hand and ended up in a muddy puddle. They tore off her clothes and pressed her down to the hard ground. Soon they were all over her. It hurt so bad, and they covered her mouth so she couldn't scream. While she was laying there in the alley with one of the men over her, she saw 2 women walking in the square not far away. They had skirts made of precious cloth. Her horrified gaze met theirs. desperately begging them for help. She saw that they saw her. She made eye contact with one of them, but they just looked away and left. When the men were done with her, she could barely move. The world around her went black. But in her daze, she could still see that they spat on her and that one of them urinated on her clothes, which were torn and thrown out next to her. She still had to put them on, because she had no others. With her clothes wet and with the blood running down her legs, she hurried as best as she could towards the city gates. Her face was so swollen that she was barely recognizable. Some people stopped and stared at her, with either distaste or disgust. Her eyes were swollen and blue, and blood was coming from her nose and gums. It hurt so bad she couldn't even cry, and she fought not to move a muscle in her face. Not a single person approached her to help her. Not a single glance expressed the slightest sympathy. To them, she was nothing. Massa couldn't take it anymore. She just wanted it all to end. In bitter despair, she left the city and walked into the forest. She had heard that trolls lived there and that they were more than happy to kill intruders. She wanted to intrude. It was evening. The night was about to fall over the forest. Her legs couldn't carry her anymore, and her entire body ached. She lay down on her back in a mossy glade. Now she just had to wait for the end. Soon the trolls would come and tear her into pieces, she hoped. But no trolls came. The night did, however, and she fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. When Massa woke up the next morning, she thought she was dead. She was sure she was in paradise because everything around her was so lovely. The sky was blue above the spruce tops, and the birds were singing happily. Yellow butterflies fluttered over the mossy rocks, and a shiny dragonfly took a little rest on her finger. It was the first time in her life that she had woken up to something beautiful. No one yelled at her or ordered her to do this or that. No one hit her back. No stinking barrel or drunk man was anywhere in sight. She lay there all day, completely still, looking up at the trees in fascination. The sun was about to go down when she finally managed to get up on her feet. She soon found that she was very hungry, but she had no desire whatsoever to go back to the city and to the hateful people. Instead, she started looking for something to eat in the forest. It wasn't that easy, and the only things she found were berries. She soon found a stream. She threw off her smelly rags and took a few careful steps into the water. She slowly sat down. The cold water cooled the aching body, dulled the pain. The late evening sun caressed her face, as if trying to heal her aching and swollen eyes. How peaceful it was. The sound of the water and the birds. The colors around her were beautiful green, and the light sparkled beautifully in the rushing stream. Here in the forest, she didn't have to be on her guard or hide. There were no people there. Massa stayed in the forest. Not for a day, not for 10, not for 100. She remained in the forest for many years. It had been difficult at first before she had fully figured out how to arrange food and fire. The first winter in the wilderness had been terrible. She had frozen so much that she often thought she would die, but rather die than to return to the humans. That was how she looked upon them, like the humans, as if they were something else, nothing like her. Humans were something evil. She learned to catch rabbits and to fish and how to build shelters to protect her from the elements. She figured out which mushroom could be eaten and which ones made her laugh or be sick for several days. She learned which plant she could use to make medicines and how to bandage her wounds. She went further and further into the forest, felt safer and more secure. She became increasingly attached to the trees and the water and the earth. She was now happy with her name, which she had always hated. Moss was something beautiful. It was something green and lively that was great if you wanted to stop a stubborn bleeding sore. In addition, it was soft and nice to sleep on and beautiful when it grew like a carpet in the forest. Mossa. Yes, it was a name that suited her. She felt proud of it. Sirens, trolls, and ghosts. She had seen so many by now that it didn't bother her anymore. The only ones she carefully avoided were the trolls, or the sarks as they were actually called. She had been chased by them a couple of times, and it had come close to ending badly. Now she had learned what kind of terrain they were in and could keep a good distance. She could make weapons and hunt the animals she needed for food and clothing. She studied the insects and animals and plants and lived in harmony with them. A fox had become her friend and followed her wherever she went. Nini was her name, and she was an excellent partner in the winter. She could find rabbits under the snow, which they then shared. Mossa was fine in the forest and even felt happy. But one thing haunted her mind constantly. Horrible dreams haunted her almost every night. Images of all the evil she had been through came night after night. All the times she had been beaten, all the times she had been raped, all the times she had been hungry and scared and frozen. Everything was replayed for her at night. Often she would wake up screaming and thrashing around wildly. Her anxiety and anger had long since turned to hatred. It was a pure and genuine hatred that burned with a violent force. She was driven by an intense desire to avenge all wrongs. It was as if she couldn't rest otherwise. It drove her mad with frustration to know that all the evil people who had treated her so terribly badly could just continue to live in this world unpunished. It just wasn't fair. One day, when she was far out in the forest, she came to a beautiful lake. She had previously lived in different places in the forest. She had come to a place, stayed for a while, and then moved on. But she wanted to start some kind of farming. It was hard to find and gather food. With a small plot of her own, she could plan her life a whole year in advance, and the small lake was a perfect place for that. Not only did the place provide water, the area was also a meadow and fairly free of large rocks and trees. There was plenty of room for a small farm. She stayed there, and the small farmland grew larger and larger. Vegetable land, spice plantation, plants for medicine. The hut that she built eventually became a cabin, which then became a house. It was a strange construction because she didn't really know how to build a house. It was completely square and consisted of a single room so large that she wondered what she was going to do with all this space. She had completely misjudged how much space she really needed. But she enjoyed herself, and she often sat with Nini outside the strange house and looked out over the lake while the great loon called in the distance. The only thing that disturbed her senses were the humans. Oh, she hated them. Oh, how she hated them. She hated them with the force of 1,000 burning suns. Mossa's connection with nature became even stronger. It had started with her being able to understand the sound of the wind whistling through the tree branches. It told her what weather was coming, and it was also how trees send messages to each other. She had learned to speak to Nini without saying a single word. She heard voices in the water, saw signs in stones, and could interpret what was said between different plants through the scent in the earth. One day she noticed that she could send messages to any life form and get a response back. And not only that, she could also ask them for different things, and they did as she said. She discovered that she could use the power of nature to shape and control things around her. The first time she tried to move a cone with pure thought, she was so scared that she never wanted to do it again. But she was too curious, so of course she did it again and took on increasingly difficult tasks. She was particularly fond of all magic that had to do with water. She studied water carefully and sat for long periods of time practicing, making the waves move as she wanted. It was handy because then she could command it to wash over her plantings, which were right on the lake's edge. In this way, she did not have to carry water herself for half a day. One evening, much later, while she was wandering in the forest looking for a particular plant to make tea from, an accident happened. A large boar had become upset that she was tramping around in his territory, and without the slightest warning, he came charging at her with fury. His tusks were sharp and huge, and she quickly calculated that her days would be over if he bumped into her. Massa reacted on pure instinct, raised her palms to the raging boar and commanded it to die. And it died, straight up and without any frills. Nini and Mossa feasted on that boar for several days, and she felt happy that her powers were increasing. The whole thing became almost like a drug. The more she discovered of the power, the more she wanted to learn, the stronger she wanted to become. The thoughts of a righteous revenge against the humans were constantly in the back of her head. Someday, when she was strong enough, she would return to the humans, and then they would receive their punishment. As her magic increased in strength, her eyes began to change. They had been blue and rather sad until she came to the forest. After that, they had become alert. But the power of magic is reflected in the eyes. Her eyes began to gaze more and more inwards, as if the world to be seen was inside of her rather than outside. The eyes became more and more intense, more focused, deeper. The gaze became more distant at the same time as it became more present, and the color of the eyes changed. They became brighter, colder, harder. If people had seen her eyes, they would have said that her eyes were shining or glowing, but they weren't. Not at all, actually. That was just the closest description for how violently penetrating and intense they were. And so came the day when Massa felt ready to take a trip to the city.